We now turn to the ethics of belief, where ethics connects to epistemology. So there are, of course, as always in philosophy, many questions, such as, do we have a moral duty to believe propositions to the degree that the evidence supports them? And the idea behind this question is, of course, it may be epistemically wise, of course, and to believe things based on evidence. And of course, looking at critical thinking and logic, the rational thing to do is to accept a conclusion based on the degree the evidence logically supports them. But this is the moral question. Do we have a moral obligation to believe things based on the evidence that supports them, or not? Second question, what sort of duties are there, if any, in relation to believing? Does morality actually have some dominion over epistemology or not? Now, of course, in ethics, there's a general assumption, which not everyone, of course, agrees with, because philosophy, that to have a duty or an obligation to do something implies that we are capable of doing it. Because it makes no sense, at least to most philosophers, to say you're obligated to do this, but it's something you can't do. That would seem, it would violate kind of the practicality principle of ethics, where you've got to be able to act upon the ethics. But of course, an obvious question is is our belief under our control? Can we, choose to believe or choose not to believe? Or are our beliefs forced onto us that we just kind of like with our senses, we just kind of, you open your eyes and you just see what's there. I mean, you can look away, but you just see what you see. So this leads to the general question of the relationship between the will, if there is such a thing, and belief. Can we believe something simply by willing to have it, just willing belief? Or is it the case that we can't? So can we only attain beliefs indirectly through the will, we want to believe something perhaps, and then going through a process in order to likely perhaps bring about that belief? So these are questions of ethics and epistemology where they join up. Questions about, is there an obligation to believe things based on evidence? And the question about, kind of the core question there is, if we do have obligations, then this leads to the question in epistemology, also psychology, philosophy of mind, can we choose our beliefs? And if so, to what degree? So what are these supposed epistemic duties? Well, depending on which philosopher you listen to, these in general would be duties to believe according to the evidence. One possibility, you should believe essentially based on the standards of good logic. Is it a strong inductive argument with plausible premises? Is it a valid deductive argument with plausible premises? If so, then you should believe it. If not, then at least suspend judgment. Or another way to look at it is that we may have an obligation to, not about forming particular beliefs, but essentially training ourselves to have these belief-forming mechanisms that will tend to be reliable. Kind of crudely put in practical terms, would we have an obligation to get better at, things like critical thinking, science, and so forth? It doesn't make sense to say we have a moral obligation to get better at belief-forming. Now, our good dead friend John Locke, to quote him, said that the one unerring mark by which a man may know whether he is a lover of truth for truth's sake is the not entertaining any proposition with greater assurance than the proofs it is built upon will warrant. And so, essentially what he's saying is the indicator that a person loves the truth is that they don't accept claims beyond what the evidence supports, which, seems reasonable. So, continuing with moral duties. Do we have moral duties to believe something according to the available evidence? So, if there's evidence that supports a particular, claim, are we more obligated to, accept that claim? Now, again, this of course would assume that we have the ability to do so. Now, some philosophers, our example look at is Clifford, is the view that it's morally wrong about when a person violates an epistemic obligation to believe according to the evidence. Because we could say there's an epistemic duty. You should, if you should believe based on the evidence. Similarly, like in logic and critical thinking, what you should accept logically is plausible premises with good reasoning. And Clifford says it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. So, pretty strict. Another approach, pragmatic and or prudential duties. Now, a pragmatic view is essentially believing in something, in this case, because it has a practical value. So, pragmatically, a person might believe something if it has like a payoff for them. Prudential ones, again, are also kind of practical as well, typically looked at in terms of like avoiding harms. And so we could look at it in terms of pragmatic or prudential duties to believe in order to get what we regard as the best outcomes, defined however the philosopher defines it. This includes our good dead friend David Hume, John Stuart Mill, William James, and H.H. Price. Price's view is this. So suppose, hypothetically, we were rational all the time. He claims there's nothing morally wrong about accepting unreasonable, views. Unreasonable in this case would be defined as against the evidence or without regard to the evidence. And his claim essentially is that there's not a moral failure to do this. There's nothing wicked or evil about believing things that are unreasonable, that, to use the logic terms, critical thinking terms, fallacies, bad inductive reasoning, invalid deductive arguments, implausible premises. But what he claims is a pragmatic reason, not a moral reason, but a practical one. Not about what is morally good, but what is good for you. So he thinks that being unreasonable, accepting things unreasonably, would be contrary to long-term interest. In other words, it would not be morally bad, but practically and prudentially bad. Because he claims it's in our long-term interest to believe true things rather than false ones. And if we believe things based on reason, based on the evidence, it's likely that in the long run, we'll tend to believe things that will be more likely to be true than false. And this will be, we'll have a pragmatic payoff. And so the only ought here, the only should, regarding belief, acquiring beliefs, is prudential. So on this view, you can seek whatever goals you want. This is a matter for ethics. It could be happiness, salvation, convenience, pleasure, and so on. Whatever goal you got, at least according to Price, no matter what goal you're choosing to follow, good or bad, it's in your long-term interest to seek to have true beliefs. Because whatever your moral goals are, or immoral goals, you're more likely to achieve them with true beliefs, or so it could be claimed. So now, the approaches to the ethics of belief. Now, as noted earlier, the question of whether we ought or should believe propositions for various reasons raises a more foundational question, a prior question we must address. And this is the question of whether we can believe propositions, believe claims, simply by willing to do so, that it's within our power to choose our beliefs. And again, it's a common assumption in ethics that to say that we ought to do something or should do something or are obligated to do something means that we can do it. We may, fail, but at least we can make the attempt. So voluntarism, or volitionalism, is, in epistemology, the doctrine that a person can acquire beliefs directly on willing to believe them. So a person just wills it, and they have the belief. Now, in theology and philosophy of religion, there's a view called voluntarism, which is a view about God's will in the context of his, power and intellect. And the idea is that for the voluntarist, their view is that God he's all powerful, and so he can will anything, even the impossible. Now, in the context of epistemology, volitionism or voluntarism is a view that we can simply will things and, believe them. We can make it so. Now, not surprisingly, many philosophers don't accept volitionism, but even if you do decide to reject volitionism or voluntarism, this doesn't entail that you must reject the existence of epistemic duties or moral duties with regard to what are called doxastic states, a fancy term for states of belief. Because even if we can't just will it and make it so, which might seem kind of implausible, that a person could just, people can obviously just say, yeah, I believe that, but there's presumably more to belief than just saying, yeah, I believe that. So we could be able to, even though we can't directly will it, we could influence our ability to, acquire beliefs indirectly through various processes. Some odd ones could be like autosuggestion. Maybe less weird would be things like focusing on aspects of evidence and developing better belief forming mechanisms, etc. Just like, to use an analogy, a person cannot simply, will themselves to, successfully complete a marathon, but they could, go through the process of developing themselves where they could finish the marathon. And so a similar sort of thing, just simply not being able to will it, but able to bring it about. Now, Locke takes a fairly strict view, as we saw with the quote, that he argues we should never believe anything against what he calls the light of reason. Now, aside from our good dead friend John Locke, probably one of the best known philosophers of ethics, of belief, was writing in the 1800s, is the English, or rather British philosopher, W.K. Clifford, 1845 to 1879. And he's kind of the go-to, the standard. He's not Clifford the Big Red Dog. That is, of course, there for humorous purposes, not an attempt to challenge the copyright or trademarks. So what he does is this, in his classic work, The Ethics of Belief, he looks at reason's roadblock to pragmatic justifications for acquiring beliefs, not fully supported by the evidence. And he argues that there is an ethics to believing that makes all believing without sufficient evidence immoral. So pretty broad. So if a person believes something, then they are, and it's not based on sufficient evidence, that would not only be like bad logic, bad reasoning, bad idea, but also morally bad. Now, what about the pragmatic justifications? Where someone says, I'm believing this because it's pragmatic and then, it's beneficial to me. And he claims that these aren't justifications at all, but mere counterfeits of genuine justifications. And the only genuine justifications for him must always be based on evidence, not pragmatism. And as you might suspect, this is a matter of, concern in critical thinking, especially in the context of fallacies, because there are what we could call pragmatic reasons to accept a claim in order to gain, and then there would be logical reasons to accept a claim that, as I say, it's based on evidence. So Clifford, the philosopher, not the big red dog, his example that's the standard used in discussion of ethics belief is a person who owns a ship owner, who sends an immigrant ship to sea. Now, this owner knows the ship is old and is not well built, but he doesn't have the ship inspected because it would cost money. So what does he do? Well, he basically dismisses from his mind any doubts and suspicions he has about the unseaworthiness of this vessel. and he trusts in Providence to take care of it. So essentially, on Clifford's view, the person sort of convinces themselves, and they acquire a sincere and comfortable conviction the ship will be safe. So they believe everything's, they basically sort of persuade themselves into accepting everything is fine. They form that belief. And of course, as you might suspect from the picture on the slide, after the ship sinks and all the passengers die, the owner collects their insurance money without a trace of guilt, because they believed everything was, fine, convinced himself of that. And of course, accidents do happen at sea, and this was just an unfortunate accident, as they see it, that had nothing to do with the problems with the ship that they, obviously simply put out of their mind. So even if the person sincerely believed that all was well with the ship, this sincerity does not, justify or exculpate them, because they had no right to believe, given the evidence that was available to them. The easily available evidence was the ship is unsafe, and they simply decided to believe something else. And he claims that we have an obligation to get ourselves in a position where we will only believe propositions on sufficient evidence. So essentially his view is, we may not be able to just auto-will ourselves into believing things, but we're obligated to make ourselves such that we only believe things based on sufficient evidence. Now, it could be objected that this is not, a matter of ethics of epistemology and belief, but a matter of, sort of standard ethics, a matter of an obligation to act in a certain way, to inspect the ship, as opposed to the ethics of believing, that the owner was obligated to inspect the ship, but was not more obligated to believe a certain way. And a person could say that although the owner does have an obligation to inspect the ship, the obvious response to this objection is the function of believing in terms of what action one takes. So a person, if they have an obligation to have the ship inspected, then they would also have an obligation to, honestly assess the evidence before them. And so Clifford says that no man holding a strong belief on one side of a question, or even wishing to hold a belief on one side, can investigate it with such fairness and completeness as if he were really in doubt and unbiased. So the existence of a belief not founded on fair inquiry unfits a man for the performance of this necessary duty. And so he comes to a pretty harsh conclusion, which is the general view that he takes, that it's always wrong for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. And literally, he takes it very, strictly and broadly, anything on insufficient evidence. Now, of course, looking at it from the standpoint of ethics, you could see that there'd be, different, if you looked at it from the standpoint of, say, utilitarianism, you could say there'd be different consequences for different beliefs, but according to Clifford, any such belief would be immoral in degrees. They wouldn't claim they're all equal. So, for example, someone who believes, say, that unicorns exist, even though there's no evidence, Clifford would say that's wrong, but obviously we would probably think that's not as wrong as someone, believing something that could be very, harmful and dangerous to others, like the example Clifford gives, like someone who decides to believe that, everything is fine with the ship and everything's going to be all right, but then lots of people die. We now turn to the approach of William James, American, dead, and he's famous for being an American pragmatist. He wrote in 1896, or had published, his work, The Will to Believe, and he's responding to Clifford. He claims, and essentially it's kind of a utilitarian argument or moral argument against Clifford's view. So James argues that life would be greatly impoverished if we confined our beliefs to the very strict epistemology that Clifford proposes. Clifford, as we just saw, claimed that it's wrong to believe anything on insufficient evidence. Now, James notes that in everyday life, where the evidence for important claims are often quite unclear, he asserts, in a very American kind of view, we must live by faith or cease to act at all. So, does this mean we can just, make leaps of faith just anytime, whenever? Well, no, there's some restrictions. But sometimes he says practical considerations force us to make a decision regarding claims that do not have their truth values written on their faces. But put another way, sometimes we have to make decisions based on very limited evidence, where we would not be, say, epistemically justified in our belief, but we have to do so perhaps pragmatically anyways. So James sees belief as a live, momentous hypothesis on which we cannot avoid a decision, for the obvious reason that not to choose, in effect, is to choose against a hypothesis. Now, James continues his views in his Sentiment of Rationality in 1879, and he defines faith the following way. Faith for him is a belief in something concerning which doubt is still theoretically possible. Now, taken very, very broadly, that would make almost everything a matter of faith, because unless there's absolute certainty, you could still doubt it theoretically. Now, as he sees it, the test of a belief is a willingness to act upon the belief. So, according to him, one may say that faith is the readiness to act in a cause, the prosperous issue of which is not certified to us in advance. What does he mean? Well, basically what he's saying is the test of faith is willing to act when a good outcome is not assured ahead of time. That is faith. So what would be an example of this? Well, his example is of a mountain climber in the Alps, and they find themselves, say after an avalanche or the collapsing of some snow or ice, their only way to escape with their life is to make a huge leap. And James says if they try to calculate the evidence only believing on sufficient evidence, they'll be paralyzed by emotions of fear and mistrust, and hence, ironically and paradoxically, by trying to think about calculating the leap, they will fail in the leap and die in the crevice. Now, without evidence of being able to perform the feat successfully, James argues the climber would be better off getting themselves to believe they can, and he thinks they'll make the leap. So the idea, basically, he's basically looking at what we now would call kind of a sports psychology. The idea being that if you psych yourself out, you'll perform worse, but if you kind of, psych yourself up, you can perform better. So what he concludes from this is that in this case, the climber, the part of wisdom clearly is to believe what one desires, for the belief is one of the indispensable preliminary conditions of the realization of its object. There are then cases where faith creates its own verification. And so his view essentially is, in situations where the belief is a requirement for achieving it, then that's pragmatically, that's what you should do. And again, he's kind of looking at today what we'd call sports psychology. Now, he's not claiming that belief in something will make it true. He's not endorsing wishful thinking here, although his critics might sometimes say that. Wishful thinking is believing that something is true simply because one really wants it to be true. It's a classic fallacy. So given his views, it's hardly surprising that he claimed that religion could be such a genuine option for many people. And where it is, the individual has a right to believe the better story rather than the worse. And to do so, you must be willing to believe the evidence alone is inadequate to support. So belief, even in the face of a lack of evidence. So he endorses a pragmatic approach in contrast to Clifford's you've got to believe based on evidence. James raises the objection, well, if you do that, you could die in a skiing accident. And so there are cases where you pragmatically must will to believe what the evidence doesn't actually support by itself. Not, that there's evidence against it, but one must do it based on pragmatism. Now, another philosopher who was concerned about ethics of belief is Jack Myland, whose name I'm probably horribly mispronouncing. His work is What Ought We Believe? And so he looks at, very similar to James, the question of, can pragmatic reasons override epistemic reasons in belief formation? Or more importantly, whether they should. And he thinks that they may. He argues for that. And so he thinks that it's sometimes permissible, and even our moral duty, to believe against the evidence. As an example, loyalty to a friend or fear of a disastrous psychological consequence may be sufficient reasons for rejecting the available evidence and forming beliefs. Now, this, of course, is something that other philosophers would point out is the classic, in the case of fear of disastrous psychological consequences, that'd be the classic fallacy of appeal to the consequences of a belief, that a belief, a claim is rejected because believing it or accepting it would have terrible consequences. Or the reverse, that a claim is believed because rejecting it would have terrible consequences. Not in terms of acting on things that actually are true or false, but simply the belief itself. So, not surprisingly, some would be critical of this view, the pragmatic view, because it does seem to entail engaging in what would be considered fallacious reasoning. But of course, the counter would be is that, well, yes, it's bad reasoning, but morality in a way sort of overrides that. And before getting to John Locke in detail, as our final reading, we close with Pogemon. He is known for having written a lot of books in ethics and other areas. Really kind of a king of anthologies in a way. So Pogemon ends up arguing against volitionism on two grounds. First, he claims, kind of very harsh criticism, that it is psychologically aberrant and conceptually incoherent. So our ability to obtain beliefs directly on willingness to have them, he claims, is at best a rare phenomenon, something we typically can't, reliably do. Second, in opposition to Myland, he argues that we do have moral duties to believe according to the best evidence, in the same sense that we can indirectly get ourselves in the position where the best justified belief is likely to obtain. And that's kind of the battle over the ethics of belief, kind of between one extreme, Clifford, where you've got to believe things based on evidence or you're acting immorally, to William James's pragmatism, and then counters against pragmatism as well. And our final reading on the ethics of belief is from our good dead friend John Locke, which we'll pick up with later. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.